Right now you feel alone, disconnected, unchosen. But this pause is not punishment, it is alignment. By the time need dies, union becomes inevitable. Most people have been taught, quietly, emotionally, and repeatedly, that needing someone is the same thing as loving them, that dependence is intimacy, and that closeness is proven by how uneasy we feel when another person withdraws. That belief sits so deep in the nervous system that it rarely gets questioned, yet it is precisely here that creative power begins to leak. When the feeling of safety, worth, or provision is tied to another person, what looks like connection is often just dependency wearing a softer name. The law does not respond to sentiment, it responds to position. And the moment your inner posture says, "I need," authority quietly moves elsewhere. Neville Goddard made this principle uncomfortably clear when he spoke about dependence fragmenting creative power. To depend is not merely to want, it is to divide authorship. It is to place the source of life, love, or money outside the self, and then wait for permission to receive what consciousness was meant to generate. Neville illustrated this with a simple but piercing image. Looking to another for bread while sitting at your own table. The table is already set, the bread already present, yet the eyes keep drifting outward, hoping someone else will confirm what is already yours. In that outward gaze, assumption weakens, not because the law is cruel, but because it is exact. When separation appears, most interpret it as punishment, rejection, or loss, but the law is not emotional, and it is never vindictive. Separation is not removal, it is return. It is consciousness being guided back to its own center, back to I am, where authority has always lived. When people fall away, when support dissolves, when familiar channels close, the instinct is to grieve what seems taken. Yet what is actually happening is far more surgical. Power is being handed back. The law removes what you are leaning on so that you are forced, gently or abruptly, to stand where creation originates. Modern neuroscience mirrors this truth in a different language. Dr. Joe Dispenza explains that emotional dependence dysregulates the nervous system, locking it into survival patterns where the body is constantly scanning for external reassurance. In that state, creation collapses into reaction. The system cannot sustain coherent intention when it is busy monitoring other people for cues of safety. Emotional independence, by contrast, restores internal regulation and with it, creative coherence. When the nervous system settles back into self-reference, the mind regains clarity, and intention once again has a stable platform from which to operate. This is why money, in particular, responds so dramatically to shifts in need. Money is not sentimental, it mirrors structure. When you stop needing people, emotionally, psychologically, or symbolically, assumption regains command. Supply begins to reorganize, not because you forced it, but because you stopped leaking authority. What once seemed to come through others starts returning inward, first as a feeling of quiet sufficiency, then as a change in posture, and eventually as visible reordering in the world. The thesis of this entire teaching is simple but demanding. Creation resumes the moment you no longer require anyone else to complete you. When I am stands alone, everything else knows exactly where to appear. At first, the disruption feels subtle, almost reasonable, because the mind has been trained to justify need as strategy. It sounds logical to believe that money arrives through people, that opportunities are granted by others, and that security depends on maintaining certain relationships. Yet beneath that logic sits an unexamined assumption that supply exists somewhere outside the self and must be accessed, requested, or earned through external approval. The moment this assumption takes root, creation quietly shifts location. Authority is no longer centered in consciousness. It is outsourced, and whatever is outsourced is no longer commanded. When need becomes the emotional posture, supply is automatically placed elsewhere. It may wear the face of a boss, a partner, a client, or a system, but energetically, it is the same gesture every time. Waiting. Waiting is not patience. It is position. To need is to stand at the door of something you already own and hesitate, as though ownership requires permission. It is like waiting to be invited into a house whose deed is already in your name. The house does not resist you, but it also does not chase you. Until you step inside as the owner, nothing rearranges itself to serve you. Money responds to this posture with precision. It does not withdraw out of punishment, nor does it disappear because of bad luck. It simply follows authority. When the inner stance says, "Someone else determines this," money mirrors that statement by remaining conditional, delayed, or routed through unpredictable channels. The law cannot violate position. If supply is assumed to be external, then experience must reflect separation, not because separation is desired, but because coherence demands it. This is where the disruption intensifies, because the law does not negotiate with dependency. If supply feels external, separation must occur. The very relationships or structures that seemed necessary begin to destabilize, not as an act of cruelty, but as a correction. The law removes the illusion that power lives outside by dismantling the circumstances that supported that illusion. What feels like being pushed away is often consciousness being pushed back into itself. Most resistance arises here because the mind interprets disruption as danger. Yet, disruption is the first honest signal that a deeper order is restoring itself. When money slows, when people withdraw, when familiar paths close, it is rarely a sign of failure. It is evidence that the old posture can no longer be sustained. The law is not taking something away, it is exposing where you have been standing. And once that position is seen clearly, the entire structure of supply is forced to reorganize around a different center. There is a moment in every genuine shift of power where life appears to move in reverse, where what once felt supportive is suddenly absent, and where stability seems to dissolve rather than strengthen. This is the great reversal, and it is often misunderstood because it contradicts emotional expectation. The mind anticipates reward, reinforcement, or expansion. Yet the law begins with subtraction, not to diminish, but to recalibrate. Before power can be restored, the structures that diluted it must be removed. The law has no interest in preserving emotional crutches. Anything that consciousness leans on instead of standing as I am becomes an obstacle to its own authority. Separation, then, is not random, nor is it personal. It is corrective. Just as a cast must be removed before a muscle can regain its strength, support must be withdrawn before inner authority can return. The removal feels abrupt, only because dependence had been normalized. What is actually happening is a return to original function. Loss, in this context, is not failure. It is a realignment of cause and effect. When something falls away, it is rarely because it was wrong or harmful in itself, but because it was occupying a role it was never meant to hold. People, relationships, and systems are not designed to be sources. They are meant to be reflections. When they are unconsciously promoted to the position of cause, the law intervenes to correct the hierarchy. That intervention is separation. This reversal often carries a quiet clarity once the initial shock fades. Without the external support, consciousness is forced to confront its own capacity. There is no one left to defer to, no one left to credit or blame. In that solitude, something stabilizes. Authority, which had been scattered across circumstances, begins to consolidate. The law does not rebuild until this consolidation is complete. What appears as a step backward is, in truth, a return to center. The law always corrects position before it restores flow. Separation is the pause that allows strength to reform, assumption to reassert itself, and creation to resume from its rightful source. If this is shifting how you see power and separation, stay with the channel. Subscribe now so these reminders keep returning you to I am instead of pulling you back into need. Dependence does not announce itself as weakness. It often disguises itself as cooperation, support, or even humility. Yet beneath these respectable names lies a subtle fracture of authority. Assumption is only effective when it is singular, when consciousness recognizes itself as the sole source from which experience flows. The moment attention is split between self and another, power is no longer unified. It is shared, negotiated, and therefore weakened. When dependence enters, assumption loses its edge. The inner conversation shifts from "this is" to "will this be allowed?" That shift may be quiet, but it is decisive. Authority cannot operate on consensus. Creation responds to a clear command, not a committee. This is why dependence feels heavy over time. It requires constant monitoring, constant adjustment, and constant emotional calibration with others. The mind becomes preoccupied with reactions instead of resting in decision. The image of two signatures required on a check captures this perfectly. Nothing clears, not because the account is empty, but because authority is divided. One signature says yes, the other hesitates. One claims ownership, the other seeks validation. The system freezes, not out of malice but out of inconsistency. The law does not move when signals conflict. As long as assumption is diluted by dependence, results remain conditional. They appear sporadically, arrive with tension, or vanish as quickly as they come. This instability is not a flaw in the law, it is feedback. It reflects the inner split between knowing and needing. Until authority becomes singular, experience cannot stabilize. When dependence dissolves, assumption regains its clarity. There is no longer a second voice to consult, no external reference to align with. Authority settles back into one center. From that position, creation becomes simpler, calmer, and far more consistent. The law responds immediately to unity because unity is its native language. The phrase, "everyone is you pushed out," carries a precision that is often lost when it is treated as a comforting slogan rather than a structural law. It does not mean that others exist to please you, nor does it suggest that the world is obligated to perform on demand. It describes something far more exacting. The outer world is a mirror that reflects inner position, not inner desire. Reflection follows posture, and posture is defined by where authority is placed. As long as consciousness remains self-referenced, the mirror responds cleanly. The moment that reference shifts outward, reflection falters. Needing another person is not a minor emotional preference. It is a relocation of cause. In need, the center of gravity moves from assumption to anticipation. Instead of deciding and resting, the mind waits and watches. It scans expressions, listens for tone, interprets timing, and assigns meaning to silence. None of this feels dramatic at first. It often feels reasonable, even relational. Yet, energetically, something crucial has changed. Authority has been placed in the response of another, and reflection can no longer function as intended. The mirror analogy reveals the flaw immediately. Expecting a mirror to move first is not impatience. It is a misunderstanding of order. The mirror does not initiate, it answers. When consciousness waits for others to confirm value, safety, or direction, it is asking the reflection to lead the source. That reversal breaks symmetry. The mirror hesitates, distorts, or appears unresponsive, not because it has failed, but because it cannot violate its function. This is why the dynamic with others often shifts the moment need deepens. Conversations become strained, responses slow, opportunities feel conditional, and emotional distance appears where closeness once existed. From the outside, it looks like rejection or withdrawal. From the level of the law, it is calibration. The reflection is adjusting to a new posture, one in which sovereignty has been partially surrendered. The outer world does not argue with that posture, it simply mirrors it. What makes this especially difficult is that need often disguises itself as care or attachment. It tells a convincing story, that connection requires dependence, that love must involve vulnerability to loss, that support is proof of closeness. But the law does not respond to stories, it responds to structure. When another person is unconsciously assigned the role of stabilizer, validator, or source, the inner position becomes conditional. Assumption weakens because assumption requires finality, not negotiation. In this weakened position, reflection cannot remain consistent. Others may seem unpredictable, distant, or resistant, yet they are only responding to the mixed signal they are receiving. One part of consciousness claims authority, while another seeks confirmation. The mirror reflects that split as inconsistency. The world cannot stabilize what the self has divided. Restoring reflection is not about detaching emotionally or withdrawing from relationships. It is about restoring causation to its proper place. The posture must shift back to self-reference, where experience is assumed rather than requested. When the inner stance no longer needs others to move, approve, or reassure, symmetry begins to return. The mirror does not need instruction, it only needs clarity. As authority consolidates, something subtle but unmistakable occurs. Interactions lose their charge. Conversations feel lighter. Responses arrive without effort, not because others have changed independently, but because the source has stabilized. The mirror resumes its role naturally. Reflection no longer resists. because there is nothing to resist against. There is only position. This is the quiet power behind the principle. Everyone is you pushed out, not when you are trying to manage outcomes, but when you are standing firmly as cause. The law does not reward need, nor does it punish it. It simply reflects position with absolute honesty. When need disappears, reflection does not rush in dramatically. It returns calmly, efficiently, and without negotiation. Until authority is reclaimed, the mirror waits. It cannot move first. It never has. There is a quiet moment, often misunderstood, where consciousness begins to gather itself again after dependence has dissolved. This is where Sats, the state akin to sleep, reveals its true function. It is not a technique for visualization, nor a method for persuading the mind to believe something new. Sats is reunification. It is the return of scattered authority back into a single center, where identity no longer leaks into people, circumstances, or outcomes. When power has been habitually invested in others, much of one's energy lives outside the body. Attention hovers around conversations, expectations, and imagined responses. Even in silence, the mind remains extended, subtly waiting. Sats interrupts this extension. As the body relaxes and the senses soften, the outward pull loses its grip. The nervous system stops scanning. Awareness begins to fold inward, not forcefully but naturally. What was projected outward is gently recalled. This is why Sats often feels different after separation. Instead of excitement or vivid imagery, there may be a sense of gathering, as though pieces are being brought home. The analogy of calling your energy back into your body is precise here. It is not about creating a future scene. It is about restoring presence. In this state, identity stops reaching for confirmation. It rests, and in resting, it consolidates. The law responds immediately to this consolidation, even if nothing appears to happen on the surface. Assumption becomes quieter but stronger. There is less effort, less emotional charge, and less urgency. The self is no longer trying to secure outcomes through others. It is stabilizing as cause. Sats supports this by suspending the habitual patterns that kept authority divided. In the softness of that state, the old need has nothing to attach to. Yet this reclamation often produces an unexpected sensation: emptiness. Not the dramatic emptiness of loss, but a neutral space where familiar emotional feedback is absent. The mind may interpret this as lack, boredom, or even loneliness. In reality, it is the absence of projection. When energy returns to the self, the outer hooks dissolve, and what remains is quiet. This quiet is not a problem. It is evidence that power is no longer leaking. Many misunderstand this phase and rush to fill it. They attempt to replace people with affirmations, excitement, or mental effort. But Sats is not meant to stimulate. It is meant to stabilize. The emptiness is the space where authority re-anchors itself. It is the pause between dependence and sovereignty. If left undisturbed, it resolves on its own into a grounded sense of completeness that does not require validation. In this stabilized state, assumption changes quality. It is no longer an act of will, but a condition of being. Identity feels whole, self-contained, and sufficient. From here, imagining feels different. It is less about getting and more about acknowledging. Scenes arise without strain, and feelings settle without effort. Creation resumes, not because something was forced, but because nothing is missing. Sats, then, is not a tool to get things from life. It is the environment in which life reorganizes itself around a restored center. When power is fully reclaimed from people, circumstances lose their grip, and assumption regains its natural authority. What follows is not immediate noise or dramatic confirmation, but a calm certainty that no longer depends on anyone else to sustain it. After power has been reclaimed and identity has begun to stabilize, there is often a phase that feels quieter than expected, almost anticlimactic. The drama has faded, the struggle has loosened, yet nothing has rushed in to replace what was released. This is where loneliness appears, not as an emotional failure, but as an adversary that tests whether authority has truly returned home. It is subtle, understated, and easy to misinterpret. This loneliness is not the same as missing someone, nor is it the ache of abandonment. It is the absence of emotional noise that once filled the inner space. When dependence dissolves, the constant feedback loop of validation, reassurance, and reaction goes silent. The nervous system, long accustomed to external cues, suddenly finds itself without reference points. The mind may label this unfamiliar quiet as emptiness or isolation, but structurally something else is happening. Authority is no longer being echoed back through others. The analogy of silence after the crowd leaves the stage captures this precisely. While the performance is happening, energy flows outward and returns amplified. Applause, movement, and attention keep the performer oriented. But when the crowd disperses, the stage remains bare and still. The silence does not mean the performance was meaningless. It means it is complete. What remains now is presence without audience. This is where many retreat. The impulse to reattach, to seek distraction, or to recreate emotional engagement can be strong. Not because something is wrong, but because the old orientation has not fully released its grip. The law does not intervene here, it observes. Loneliness becomes the final test of authority, not by punishing, but by waiting to see whether consciousness will stand without leaning. Those who misinterpret this phase often believe they have lost momentum. They assume creation has stalled or that something vital is missing. In reality, the system is recalibrating at a deeper level. Authority is learning to exist without witnesses. Identity is stabilizing without reflection. This is a rare position, and it cannot be rushed. Remaining calm here is not an act of discipline, it is a recognition. Nothing has gone wrong. The quiet is functional. It is the environment in which sovereignty finalizes itself. When consciousness does not flinch, does not grasp, and does not seek replacement, the law registers completion. Dependence has not only been removed, it has been rendered unnecessary. What emerges on the other side of this phase is subtle but profound. There is a sense of being accompanied by oneself, a grounded self-sufficiency that does not isolate but steadies. Relationships, when they reappear or reorganize, no longer carry the weight of supply. They become expressions, not supports. Interaction loses urgency and gains clarity. Loneliness, then, was never an enemy. It was the final mirror, reflecting whether authority had truly consolidated. Those who pass this phase do not feel triumphant or dramatic. They feel settled. The inner posture no longer reaches outward to complete itself. It stands quietly, fully formed. From this position, creation resumes without friction. Money, people, and opportunities return, not as lifelines, but as natural extensions of a stabilized center. The adversary dissolves, not because it was defeated, but because it is no longer needed. Authority has taken its place, and the law responds accordingly. There comes a point where the change becomes visible, not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a quiet rearrangement of how supply moves. This is the bridge of incidents, though it rarely announces itself as such. What is most noticeable at first is what no longer happens. Money stops arriving through the familiar people, roles, or emotional negotiations that once seemed essential. The channels that were tied to approval, favor, or personal leverage grow silent. For many, this feels unsettling, as if something reliable has been removed without explanation. Yet this pause is not absence, it is reorganization. When dependence dissolves, the law must rebuild the structure of supply so that it matches the new posture of consciousness. Money can no longer flow through pathways that imply reliance on others, because those pathways would contradict the restored authority of I am. The bridge, therefore, begins with interruption. Old roots close, not because they were wrong, but because they belong to a former identity. The law does not mix structures. A new position requires new movement. The analogy of water being rerouted once a blockage is removed captures this phase precisely. For a time, the flow appears reduced, even stagnant, because the pressure that once forced it through narrow channels has disappeared. But beneath the surface, something more intelligent is happening. The system is redistributing itself, finding paths that require less force and no intermediaries. When the redirection completes, the flow returns smoother, steadier, and without the turbulence that once accompanied it. What often surprises people is how impersonal the new channels feel. Money may arrive through unexpected sources, casual interactions, or systems that do not demand emotional engagement. There is less drama, less negotiation, and less psychological weight attached to receiving. The nervous system no longer spikes with relief or anxiety because supply is no longer tied to relational tension. It feels neutral, almost ordinary. This ordinariness is the signal that alignment has occurred. During this bridge, the temptation is to interpret the quiet as delay or uncertainty. But the law is not slow, it is exact. It will not restore flow until the new identity is stable enough to sustain it without reverting to need. The pause protects the recalibration. It ensures that money, when it returns, reinforces sovereignty rather than undermining it. As the bridge completes, a subtle confidence settles in. Not optimism and not expectation, but familiarity. Supply no longer feels like something granted or negotiated. It feels like something that belongs. The world begins to respond accordingly. Opportunities appear without strain. Transactions complete without emotional charge. Money moves with a calm efficiency that reflects the inner order from which it now flows. The bridge of incidents is not a test of patience nor a trial to endure. It is the visible architecture of alignment taking shape. When money stops coming through people, it is because it no longer needs to. The law has found a cleaner route, one that matches a consciousness no longer divided by dependence. Once that route is established, flow resumes, not as a reward, but as a natural consequence of restored authority. The final shift is not dramatic, yet it is decisive. What changes is not the amount of money, nor even the frequency with which it appears, but the principle from which it flows. Supply no longer feels tied to relationships, moods, or circumstances. It becomes an expression of identity. This is the movement from relationship-based supply to identity-based supply, and it signals that assumption has stabilized at the level where it no longer wavers. Relationship-based supply is inherently conditional. It depends on dynamics, timing, and emotional exchange. Even when it functions smoothly, it carries an undercurrent of vigilance. Attention remains partially outward, monitoring whether the connection will hold, whether favor will continue, whether circumstances will shift. Money in this structure feels personal. It arrives with relief or tension, and its absence feels like loss. The nervous system stays involved because supply is still linked to external variables. Identity-based supply operates on an entirely different axis. Money reflects self-reliance of consciousness, not in the sense of effort or isolation, but in the sense of authorship. Identity no longer negotiates its worth or viability through others. It assumes itself as cause. From that position, supply organizes automatically. There is no emotional contract attached to receiving, no sense of owing or being evaluated. Money becomes functional rather than symbolic. The analogy of power shifting from extension cords to a generator captures this transformation clearly. Extension cords require external outlets, constant checking, and careful placement. They work, but they are fragile. A generator, once activated, produces power from within. It does not depend on proximity or permission. Identity-based supply feels like that internal generator. It runs quietly, consistently, and without drama. This shift often brings a sense of calm that can feel unfamiliar at first. There is less excitement around gains and less anxiety around fluctuations. The emotional highs and lows that once accompanied money soften. This is not indifference, it is stability. When supply reflects identity, it no longer needs to announce itself. It integrates into life as a given rather than an event. Mastery of assumption is evident here, not through control, but through ease. There is no compulsion to prove, no urgency to secure, and no fear of collapse. Identity holds its position regardless of temporary appearances. Money responds by maintaining its flow, adjusting as needed without crisis or resistance. At this level, relationships also reorganize. They are no longer conduits for survival or validation. They become expressions of shared resonance rather than sources of supply. This does not diminish connection, it clarifies it. Interaction becomes cleaner, freer, and more honest, because nothing essential is at stake. From relationship-based supply to identity-based supply, the law completes its correction. What began as separation resolves into alignment. Authority rests where it belongs, and creation mirrors that rest. Money flows not because it is chased or managed, but because identity has assumed its rightful place as cause. What ultimately reveals itself is the simplicity Neville pointed to without compromise. Needing ends creation, assuming restores it. Need fractures authority by placing power in people and circumstances, while assumption gathers it back into I am. Separation, then, was never abandonment. It was alignment correcting posture, removing substitution so authorship could return. The mirror never failed. It only waited. Once the inner stance stabilized, reflection resumed naturally. As Dr. Joe Dispenza notes, emotional independence restores coherence to the system, allowing creation to flow without strain. In quiet completeness, SATS becomes recognition rather than effort. Neville's reminder remains final and sufficient. I am is the only giver. If this clarified where your power truly lives, subscribe and stay aligned here, where assumption is refined and authority remains with I am.